Sheldon to manage your own muting and unmuting as you see fit. For those of you who are joining us today for this forum on the Eucharist and what's happening generally with the Eucharist as we are celebrating services virtually, there's going to be two ways for you to participate and share your questions. One is that you can write them in the chat box, and we'll try to keep track of them and respond to them. Another is that at the end of the forum, we'll invite some conversation. Maybe throughout we'll also pause and just ask for some questions or comments. So we do want this, even though it's in a virtual format, to feel like a conversation and like your actual interests and questions are being addressed. So welcome. I am going to get started by summarizing very generally the kind of Eucharistic theology of the Episcopal Church. Now, for those of you who know much about the Eucharistic theology of the Episcopal Church, you know that this is utterly impossible, no matter how much time we had, but particularly challenging if you're trying to do it in about 5 minutes. So I'm going to give you the highlights. I'm not going to dive into everything that we need to know. First, I'll just begin by acknowledging that when we talk about the Eucharist, we talk about celebrating it. I think that's really important. The Eucharist is always a celebration. It's a celebration of the life of Christ. It's a celebration of the incarnation of Christ. It's a celebration of the community that God gathered together in Christ and that was revealed to us in the life of Jesus of Nazareth. So it's helpful to just remember behind everything that we do in a Eucharistic liturgy is celebration. Eucharist itself comes from a Greek word meaning thanksgiving. So similarly, around this theme of celebrating, essential to the story that we tell in the Eucharistic liturgy and that we enact as a community celebrating it, is giving thanks. We thank God for the gifts of bread and wine. We thank God for the gifts of our own life, our bodies, our breath. We thank God for the gifts of each other, in whom Christ is made known to us and revealed more fully. According to the rubrics of the Episcopal Church, only someone ordained into the priesthood, which would include a bishop, can celebrate the Eucharist. So a deacon can distribute Eucharist, but they cannot celebrate it. In certain circumstances, lay people are allowed to distribute the consecrated bread and wine. So the format most familiar to us at Christ Church for that would be the lay Eucharistic visitors who are trained and licensed in the church to take communion to people who are not able to come to church on your regular Sunday morning when the meal is really being celebrated at the altar. There are other formats. The bishop can make an allowance wherein a lay person could distribute communion or a deacon could distribute communion in a different setting, but that really is at the discretion of your bishop diocesan. The four basic actions of our Eucharist that I think are familiar to all of us in one form or another are sort of taking and receiving the elements, the bread and the wine, blessing them, which is what we understand the priest to be doing at the altar, breaking them, and giving them. Now, an important thing that I'm going to come back to later is this notion of the priest blessing the bread and the wine at the table. Because we as Episcopalians understand that only a priest can say those words, only a priest can stand behind the altar and stand in for Christ as the host of this table. But ultimately, the priest is not the host. It is Christ who is the host. And the priest is saying the words on behalf of the gathered community. The Eucharistic celebration always begins with this back and forth, the sursum corda, where we talk about lifting up our hearts. And essentially, that's a way of the community saying, it's like a greeting. It's basically the community saying to the priest, yes, we want together to celebrate this meal. So please continue and say these words on our behalf. It's a way to acknowledge that the whole congregation is participating in what's happening at the table. We do not, as a denomination, have only one understanding of what is happening in the Eucharist, or how it is that Christ is fully present to us in and through it. Some people hold on to the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. There's some sort of mystical transformation happening in the elements themselves. Some people hold to a more Protestant understanding and say this meal is a memorial. It's a reminder of the Last Supper. It is a reenactment, and it is holy because we deem it holy. But it is not about the bread and the wine in some real sense becoming the body and blood of Jesus Christ. The way that the Episcopal Church manages to kind of hold all of that together, hopefully coherently, is by talking about real presence. So we say, whatever sense you make of the Eucharist, we believe that Jesus is really present. And we don't try to go much further than defining that. We essentially say, it's enough for us to say that Jesus is really present in these elements. A couple other important things to note are that our tradition has long since found it to be true that receiving one element can stand in for both. So at the beginning of this pandemic, if you'll remember, we were still gathering and we could receive the bread, but we were not receiving the wine. Our bishop issued guidance that the wine was not to be distributed. We understand the bread to include the body and the blood. We understand the wine to also include the body and the blood. So if for some reason you are not as able to receive one or the other, we say that receiving one also means that receiving in one kind means that you are participating fully in communion. It's not like the bread is only the body and the wine is only the blood. Lastly, we're going to come back to this passage from 1 Corinthians where a lot of our Eucharistic practice is defined, but there is this dual sense that Paul commends to us when he's talking to a church who's having a hard time with figuring out how to celebrate the Eucharist together, that Jesus is not only revealed in the bread and the wine, though he is revealed in the bread and the wine, but that he is also revealed in the community that is gathered together. And he leaves it quite ambiguous, and I think our church strives to trust Paul and to let Paul's ambiguousness there stand in saying that when we celebrate the Eucharist, we are not only looking to experience God in the bread and the wine, we're also looking to experience God in each other, which is part of why we never, even as priests, we actually cannot celebrate the Eucharist alone. So if I were to say the words at the altar and do all of the ritual motions, it would not be the Eucharist. I could call it a beautiful meal and an incredible remembrance, but it would not meet the rubrics of the church to be a Eucharist. This is one reason, we'll get into this later, why every time that we have celebrated the Eucharist virtually, Deanne, who is in my germ cohort because we work together, comes into the church and sits somewhere way in the back, so that I can actually celebrate the Eucharist on behalf of the community. So we need at least one other person to be present. So that was a very quick and dirty summary about some of the things that are important. The rest of this will be much more story-based, but I'm going to pass it over to Julie and then to Sheldon to talk a little bit about your understandings of your Eucharistic theology, any stories from Scripture or your life that really inform how you understand the Eucharist. And then we'll start talking a little bit about the virtual celebrations that we've been doing and which we'll continue doing for some time. So I will ask Julie to take it over.
Thank you, Claire. So thinking about this weekend, I was reminded of a story from about, 16 or 17 years ago. And I was part of St. Timothy's Episcopal Church in Mountain View. We had this wonderful children and family service where during the service, the sermon was only a children's sermon. And then after the whole Eucharistic service was over, we sent the children to godly play or to the nursery. And then the adults regathered for their adult sermon, which was a really excellent experience because you didn't have to worry about your children being noisy or causing trouble. And then also the adult sermon could have adult themes that might not necessarily be appropriate for children. And there was a group of friends that I had, three of us that were really close, myself and Christine and Elaine. We noticed that Elaine often came sliding into church on or about the closing hymn and was there for the sermon. And so we had this whole conversation about it. And we discovered that I, having grown up Roman Catholic, and my friend Christine, having grown up as a cradle Episcopalian, were really invested in being in the service for Eucharist. for the Eucharistic prayer, to receive the bread and the wine, that we were really attached to this sacrament and what meaning it had for us. And our friend Elaine, who had grown up in a tradition that didn't include Eucharist, was really there for the sermon. She came to church to learn something, and to hear something about how she could go out into the world and be impactful in a way that Jesus was calling her to do so. And Christine and I giggled because while our rector was an incredible preacher, we both felt like we could completely skip the sermon and get everything we needed out of the service, having been there for Eucharist. And it was a very interesting journey of discovery for me to learn that everybody comes to church for a different reason. Some people come for the music. I know people who come because the building is beautiful. Some people come to say the prayers they've always said, right? And so it's been an interesting journey for me to learn about all of the reasons why people come, and that it isn't for everyone only about the sacrament, and it is for other people completely only about the sacrament, and all the rest of it is kind of gravy. But as I thought about that this week, it occurred to me that I am not grieving the ritual of Eucharist in the way I would expect myself to, given what I think about how important the Eucharist is to me. What I have discovered in these past months is that being here with you is what is so fulfilling to me right now. Seeing all of your faces, getting to talk to you at coffee hour, singing the music that is so familiar to me, and singing it with all of you, even though I can't hear your voices. And I think you're all certainly glad you can't hear mine. That there's something about this thing we do together that is actually more important to me right now than whether or not we get to have communion. And I was really surprised to discover that about myself. So that's where I am and how I'm experiencing it.
Thank you, Julie.
Sheldon?
Well, let's see. How I understand the Eucharist is, I've been with it so long that it's a part of me, I guess. One of the things which you become aware of when you're ordained is, as Claire was saying, this is on behalf of. We priests are we are not the focus of anything at that time. It's actually the community which is the focus at that time. If we're standing in for Jesus or we're standing in for whatever you'd like to think, it's the community actually has a great deal to say about what happens to that bread and wine. The great Amen. It's called the great Amen at the end of the Eucharist, when everybody's, forever and ever, and everybody's supposed to say Amen. It's supposed to be said with vigor. It's supposed to be said loudly. Now, when I was in the jails, going back to that little vignette for just a moment, I would carry around in my pockets, because you couldn't, it was hard to carry things around that the corrections officers would allow you to. I had actually three ultimately, little glass jars. One had wafers in it, one had a little bit of grape juice, and one had a piece of cotton with some oil for anointing. And so I was padding about the jails, when somebody asked for communion, we would have communion. That colored a lot of my thinking. So that when Bishop Mary Gray Reeves came to town, when she was just after her installation, she saw some of her clergy, and since I was canon missioner to Silicon Valley, I had a one-on-one with her. And she asked me what my sacramental theology looked like, how I was doing and everything. And I said, one of the things that I have become aware of, and the thing in the jail actually helped me get my head around this, was the notion that although we do this in church, the sacraments don't belong just in church, that they belong to the people. That God has given, this is God's gift to us, Jesus' gift to us. Jesus gives his body to us so that we will then take that inside of us, and we become in one way part of Jesus, in that he has given us his blessing, his message, and his work to do. And this is something which need not be holed up in the church. And she got in my face about this. We had words. She said, no, that's the work of a deacon. Going out into the world, taking sacraments into the world, seeing that the world can be sacramental. That's a deacon's thing. That's not you. And well, anyway, not to mix that up for a long time. A lot of my own theology about the Eucharist, I have talked about in sermons off and on. As I said, the body and the blood are meaningful to me in the ways that I think they were understood by Jews of the time. And I think it's an important thing to remember that the body being so important, sharing your own body is sharing your identity and your purpose in life. And Jesus stands there with us when we're celebrating the Eucharist, telling us, calling us all into to carry on what he began. And the absolving power of the wine, the sacrifice, that we are all cleansed from the things that will prevent us from doing this. We don't need to look any further than the wine to do that. That kind of blessing is also key to how I understand it all. And there's a whole lot more I could talk about, but I'm gonna pass it back to Claire.
Thank you, Sheldon. Both of your stories sort of remind me of my own, and in the sense that I think one of the things that the Eucharist reminds me of, essentially, is my need for God, my dependence on God. I think hunger and our need for kind of holy nourishment is so powerfully expressed in the Eucharist. The sense that we come to the table, we come before God in need of something that only God can give us. So I think a lot when I think about the Eucharist, probably of one of my early experiences of realizing that God might be calling me to ministry. I was, for about 4 months when I was 21, I was in a medical facility, and I could not go to actually receive the Eucharist. I couldn't leave, I couldn't go to church. For about 2.5 months of those 4 months, and I was in a place where my family was not nearby, the local Episcopal church, which was 45 minutes away, sent 2 lay Eucharistic visitors to bring me communion. And it was the only time I saw visitors. And it was just a total gift. And it's sort of interesting to think of how there's this reversal of that almost happening now, in that at that time, the church was able to gather and was celebrating the Eucharist. I was not able to come. I was socially distanced quite a bit. But the church provided for me the Eucharist. And now, in a strange kind of way, we are not able to gather in this space and celebrate the meal all together. And yet on occasion we still are, and we're continuing to gather together like this to observe either morning prayer or the liturgy of the Holy Eucharist, even though not everybody is receiving it, very few people. So I think that presents a really fascinating conundrum. So let's talk a little bit about what is happening virtually when we celebrate the Eucharist. So the rubrics of the Episcopal Church and starts at page 406, all the long Eucharists in the Book of Common Prayer, say that at a certain point in the liturgy, the priest is to hold or lay hands upon the bread, and to either hold or place a hand on the cup that contains the wine. So this is actually really important, because it means that touch is essential for this sacrament, for the celebration of this sacrament. This is not true for all of the sacraments of the church. So Sheldon, Julie, and I can actually, with full integrity, declare an absolution when we say the confession together. It is a sacramental act to say the confession over the people. We can do that over the computer. And how we understand that theologically is that we are actually declaring God's absolution, and you are actually receiving it through the computer. There's nothing about touch that is required of that. We can also say blessings, and our understanding of how you from far away and us from each of our own places is experiencing the blessing is basically exactly the same as if you were in these pews. Another curious one you all might have read in the diocesan guidelines, Governor Newsom passed a law, or executive order or something a few weeks ago, allowing for marriages to take place over a computer, which means in this setting, a minister could actually marry people over the computer. Actually, this is very much allowed by the rubrics of the Book of Common Prayer. I am not required to touch the people I am marrying. At no point in the liturgy do I have to touch them. The closest that we come is that point where we wrap the stole around people's hands and say a blessing over it, but we can do that virtually. You can do that without actually touching. So it's not unique to the sacrament of Eucharist that we would need to touch, but it's not universal to all of our understandings of sacramental ministries. So the presiding bishop and our own bishop, Mark, have said that the rubrics, as they understand them, are clear that touch is required for Eucharist, which means that even though you all are watching when we celebrate the Eucharist, and I know that some of you have a Ritz cracker or a little cup of orange grape juice with you, or are eating a muffin or whatever, that I actually cannot consecrate remotely. So through the computer, none of us clergy are able to actually consecrate in the same sense, whatever treats you are partaking of during the service. This is not true, you're probably aware, of every Christian denomination. There are churches who are telling their congregants, meet on Zoom, bring your bread, bring your wine, we'll celebrate it all over the online platform, no problem. So one understanding of why that is particular comes back to the rubrics of the Episcopal Church as articulated in the Book of Common Prayer. Julie, were you raising your hand to say something? Yeah, go on ahead, please.
I would also say that there are actually some Episcopal churches who are claiming that to be true. Mm-hmm. There is a wide diversity of Eucharistic theology in the Episcopal Church, as there is a wide diversity of theology on many things in the Episcopal Church. And the Diocese of El Camino Real, in which I reside, the bishop had given permission to the clergy to be consecrating via Zoom, and ended up receiving a great deal of criticism from the larger church because we are not all in agreement about that, and has since rolled that back. So there is, even within our own denomination, a lot of disagreement about how that's actually working, and how people are putting that into practice. So,
Sheldon?
Yeah, there's a piece of that which I'm not at all surprised. First of all, the fact that this is happening in some places, El Camino's been different for a long time. But this is how change happens. And the part that will get dragged into the future and probably change the rubrics to some degree is the fact that we're trying to understand where Jesus is at the moment. Moment where we do all of this. Where is he? Is this thing I'm sitting at? Does this make Jesus impossible? And are we going to say that Jesus can't operate through us at that moment, even though we're disconnected from one another? And it's going to take us a while to get there, because we are the Episcopal Church, and we do move slowly, but we do move gracefully, I think. That's the one thing that I think we got going for us. So hopefully we will get there sometime in the next General Convention or two. Back to you, Claire.
I appreciate your acknowledging that this is actually how the church grows. I think we are at one of those moments where we are going to see changes in our Eucharistic theology collectively. And also the church is currently rewriting a Book of Common Prayer. What a time to be rewriting the Book of Common Prayer when the entire church has been forced to, meet remotely online. So I'm going to dive a little bit into some of what, even though I respect my bishop, I took vows, I will understand his preferences around all of this. I think there are some really interesting theological discussions happening amongst the Episcopal Church and between Episcopal theologians, lay and ordained, and Christians of other denominations. So one of the really interesting conversations I recently saw was actually referred to me by Julie. And it was a conversation of four individuals, one lay Episcopalian, one Episcopal priest who has had an online ministry for a really long time, many years, and then two Lutheran theologians. And one of the stories that was told was about how an Episcopal priest had been sort of encouraged to try celebrating online and had, the blessings of her ecclesial bodies to do so. So she invited her congregants to bring bread and wine to the service and understood that she was indeed consecrating them remotely. This might have, I don't know, for all I know, this might have even happened in El Camino before those restrictions were changed. And that she had always understood at the altar that she was celebrating this holy meal on behalf of our community. That was really important to her. And that at the point where she lifted the bread and the wine, she looked at her little Zoom screen and she saw 25 other people lifting their bread and their wine. And she burst into tears, just total emotion to see, wow, these lay people who I am so blessed to do ministry with, they are exercising their priesthood, which we also affirm as an Episcopal Church, that every lay person, that there's a priesthood of all believers. So I think what we're seeing right now is a tension playing out between some of our orthodoxy, what's in the Book of Common Prayer, and the wider circle of orthodoxy that we also affirm. So what I mean by that is, yes, we say there's a priesthood of all believers, and yet we only we have certain understandings of our Eucharistic theology that would maybe say that that's not consistent. Another way in which I see that kind of bumping up against each other happening. Oh man, I just forgot my thought, but it will come back to me. It always comes back to me. Let me see if I wrote it down. I did not. Okay, well, it'll come back. There's another way that I was thinking about our theologies kind of being both consistent and varying.
Claire?
Yes.
There is one sacrament you haven't mentioned, and that is baptism. And my recollection is the Book of Common Prayer does provide for lay baptism.
It does, yeah. It is a preference to do it in the church, but if you are baptized by a layperson, the church affirms that it is baptism and you do not need to be rebaptized by anybody. So that is a very valid note. Thank you, Fritz.
So I don't know that anybody's asked the question about virtual baptism yet. I don't think we've quite gotten there.
No, that's true.
There's something about water and hands that seems necessary there to me, but I don't know.
Well, one of the things which, you think about and I think this is maybe why this is going slowly. You think about the issues around, okay, we lift our bread, everybody lifts their bread and wine at the same time. I think that's good. But one of the things which I think is grown on us over past long years, centuries, is that we tend to do this in a church or in some place that is set aside as being the holy place of the moment, whatever it is going to be. Even in the jail, you can do this. The issue is, how do you do this consistently and make it important? I mean, the the sacramental nature of the Eucharist is what lifts its importance in our lives. And just having bread and wine, just having the Ritz cracker, or just having the whatever, the juice, or all that stuff is fine. But at what point do we begin to dilute the overall importance of the community doing this together, and remembering why they're doing it together? And that's one of the reasons that I think we cling to our liturgies so much, is because they are the framework around which we do these things that help to define the importance of the acts themselves.
Thank you for naming that, Sheldon, because I do think that is one of the tensions at play always in what we're kind of saying and enacting. This actually reminds me of the other thing that I just forgot that I was thinking of as being in tension, that when we celebrate the Eucharist, I mean, I have long said, and I've heard our other clergy around here say many a time, that when we celebrate this holy meal, one reason why we're doing it, one part of what we're supposed to take away from it, is that every meal is holy. Every meal is an opportunity to experience God. Every single time we eat bread, wine, fruit, vegetables, whatever, is a moment to remember the gifts and the blessings of God. And every interaction with God's creation is also a reminder of that. So there is kind of this kind of dynamic play between the particularity of our sacraments and the fact that what we say they point to is universal. So in some sense, every single moment of our lives is as sacred as participating in the Eucharistic liturgy. And yet, as human beings, we need these kind of particular touchstones over and over again to remind us of that universal truth.
And that's what got me in trouble with my bishop.
Yes, Julie.
I think another thing that is sitting in tension for a lot of people is the challenge we have about really clearly defining the priest's magic hands, right? Having grown up in a Roman Catholic church where the sacraments are really important and there are 7 of them and only a priest can do them, there is a lot about, the priest having magic hands that's really important. And I think, in the Episcopal Church, we have 2 important sacraments and sacramental rites. And sacramental rites can really be, offered by other people. Even baptism can be, offered by someone who's not a priest and who's not ordained. And so, trying to understand how that now applies to our Eucharistic theology is really challenging, right? Because we say that it is the priest's ordained hands on this bread saying these important words that create an event that we call consecration, even if we're not even sure what happens in that moment. And so this is the place that I fall into, because I really reject the idea of priests having some sort of magical ability that other people don't have. But yet again, there is something about the Eucharist that's so important to me, that is so sacramental to me, that feels like it is special above all things. And so how do we honor that, right? So I don't know that I have a dog in the fight on either side, but I'm interested to hear what smart theologians have to say about it, because I think it's a really interesting conundrum.
If you're old enough to remember this, that priests used to have their thumbs and their index fingers blessed at ordination, because those are the only things you were allowed to touch the bread with. And that's about as Anglo-Catholic as you can get. And I grew up with that, and I don't magic hands. No, I don't. I'm with you, Julie. I think this is got to get beyond that.
I see Fritz has a question. We're going to open this up for conversation in 1 second. I just want to say one more thing, and then we'll have wider conversation. We'll come to you first, Fritz. So one reason we talked about doing this forum for a couple weeks But one thing that I think makes it additionally relevant is the guidelines from our diocese around regathering have been published, and the first phase makes clear that likely beyond this first phase, we will not be able to fully partake of the Eucharist together. So we are allowed to have a priest say the Eucharistic liturgy as we have been, and to have that priest on behalf of the community receive the consecrated bread themselves. But we are not able to distribute it fully. So even once we are able to gather, in all likelihood, we are still not going to be able to partake fully. So I think this is a really relevant conversation and question for us, not just while we're online, but even likely for many months as yet to come. So I want to open this up now, and you can raise your hand as Fritz did, or you can put something in the chat. So we'll come to you first, Fritz.
During sermons at churches I went to before Christ Church, I had an opportunity to read some of the stuff in the back of the prayer book.
No other Episcopalian has ever done this.
And among the, I forget exactly what it's called, but there's 70 points or something like that of difference between the Anglican community and one of the things is that the unworthiness of the priest does not detract from the blessing, the worthiness of the sacrament. Yes. I'm wondering if that thought might also apply in this particular discussion.
So first, let me comment on the theological justification behind what Fritz is talking about, and then maybe Julie or Sheldon want to speak to the second part. Yes, early on in the history of the church, as things like the Nicene Creed were being written, as things like our sacraments were being defined, so within what we call the patristic period, the first few centuries after the life of Jesus, there were tons of controversies and essentially lots of brilliant theologians and church leaders calling each other heretics for, hundreds of years. And this is how we got actually a ton of our good theology, because they were arguing with each other about what they were doing and why they were doing it. To some extent, we kind of never really stopped doing that. That is actually a very productive, fruitful place for the church to discuss and disagree. So what happened was that as priests were declared heretics by the kind of other bodies determining, at that time bishops were emerging and wider sees of the church were coming into power. So as certain perspectives were being declared heretical, and as certain priests were being kind of disbanded from their ministry at different points in time, the people began to come to those folks and say, well, I was baptized by that guy. Does that mean I need to get rebaptized? Or I was married by that guy. Does that mean that my marriage is invalid? And so it was really important in the early church, I think still today, for us to say, the grace and the goodness of a sacrament is not dependent upon the grace or the goodness of the clergy person presiding over it. That whatever happens in those sacraments happens because of God's action, not the action of us. I'd say I have seen this personally play out. My previous rector at a parish that I served was deposed. And there were people who, which means he was removed from ministry as a result of a Title IV complaint. And there were people who were married by him and who were baptized by him who really wondered if something was wrong now with their faith or their relationship to the church. I mean, it's an incredible pastoral breach. But I think a lot of them took comfort in knowing that we have this hugely long history of saying, that was not that gift, that good grace of your marriage, your baptism, the Eucharist that you were nourished by for years, that was not only about that person. So Julie or Sheldon, do you have anything you want to add to Fritz's question?
I think I would say that people are trying to make it about that, right? In the way that we often try to vilify people who are on the other side of an issue. So there was a group of people who really came after Bishop Lucinda and said terrible things about her on social media because she had given her clergy permission to consecrate virtually. And so, they're trying to make people villains and heretics and, discount the way that they're functioning sacramentally because they have a different way of coming at it. So we still try to do that to each other. But I'm glad that our prayer book reminds us that what we do in the sacraments is not about how you feel about me, or about how I may be failing in other ways.
It all comes down to the our own acknowledged unworthiness. We say the confession too on Sunday, even though we're giving an absolution, we say it and mean it. I hope. The role of the priest is stand-in in many ways. We represent something. We can't necessarily. It's like precious metals. I mean, we're not gold, but we're supposed to be the stand-in for gold at the moment. And that's really our goal, I think.
Other questions or comments, either about the Eucharist generally or the virtual experience? I can't see everyone, so hold on, let me scroll over. Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, I want to just take the last few minutes. I was anticipating being done around 12. To talk a little bit about the theological reasons behind Bishop Mark's saying that we will not celebrate the Eucharist until it is safe for all to do so. I know that there are varying reactions to that, but I think it's helpful to remember the scriptural background for this. So what he has talked about with the clergy in the diocese is also from 1 Corinthians, that letter from Paul to the church in Corinth, where that church is really struggling with how to celebrate the Eucharist faithfully. So what a great thing to turn back to in this time, as like the whole church is struggling with how to celebrate the Eucharist faithfully. And one of the concerns that Paul identifies is that the church is gathering and some people are starting the feast early. So this was like so early in the life of the church. It's not like they had bread and wine and they had all the formal prayers, but they definitely had what we think of as an agape meal. So people gathered, there was bread, there was wine, there was probably also almonds and olives and cheese and, grapes and who knows what, hummus. And at some point,
you should bring that back, by the way. I'd be all about cheese and hummus and olives, by the way.
When I was in seminary, we did a hearty Eucharist that included all these things at the table, and it was totally not sanctioned by the Episcopal Church, but it was really beautiful. I'm so glad I went to an ecumenical seminary. So they had this huge meal, and at some point somebody would say a prayer. And what happened is that the people whose lives allowed them to show up on time or even early wanted to go ahead and get started, and they would drink the yummy wine and they would eat the best cheese and they would, take part in what they felt like. And by the time people who had less control over their schedules, generally speaking, like the slaves and the people who were working really long jobs and the women, got there, a lot of the good stuff was already consumed and a lot of the prayers had already been said. And remember that table fellowship in the ancient world was, to be invited into table fellowship and for Jesus to have called like a motley crew into table fellowship was just shocking. So being invited into that, but then excluded from the full practice of it, was extremely distressing for Paul to see. So he wrote in this letter and said, you need to wait for each other. Like whatever you do, when you gather, wait for everyone to come together before you start. And what he's essentially saying there is wait for the people with the least privilege, the least freedom, the least room in their life. In our day, we might say, wait for the people who are the most vulnerable to this virus. Wait for the people who are unable to come because of age or illness or who knows what. We should wait for each other. We should have the discipline and the patience and the generosity to know that God is going to sustain us while we wait, and to trust that we'll be able to partake in the feast together eventually. So that's not to say that we cannot take issue with this decision, but I think it's helpful to understand how he, I think, is understanding that decision, and for us to understand the invitation that's included in it. It's not simply a you cannot partake at the table. It's a we are invited to remember what it is to be one in the body of Christ, which means to willingly let go of some of the privileges that might be associated with being able to partake in the feast right now. Of course, this is not perfectly practiced or perfectly coherent. In order for us to have the Eucharist at all, somebody has to say it, somebody has to consume it. It's not by any means, fair that would then only be the clergy person. And I think those of us who have been able to celebrate the Eucharist in this time and receive it feel keenly the kind of conundrum there. But let's open that up for a little bit of discussion too, because this has been relatively new in terms of our parishes hearing about these guidelines. Julie, did you unmute yourself to say something? No? Hi, Marcine. And then Fritz. I think you're unmuted, Marcine. Uh-oh, I can't hear you though. No. Okay, we'll go to Fritz. If you want to type in your question, Marcine, we can respond to it.
The guidelines that the bishop has put forth seem to exclude a large percentage of our somewhat geriatric congregation. I see Randy agrees with most of the men's club seems to be doing a thumbs up on that one. So if you're waiting for us to be immune to the virus, we're going to be sometime next year.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's some of what we as a church are being invited to acknowledge, that it might be that long before we celebrate fully together the Eucharist. Julie, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, as we get these guidelines about how we could dribble back into the church, 15 people really far apart, no music, nobody can say anything, everybody else having to be online. And I really dislike that idea. I think that we then create an experience that isn't good for anybody. It isn't good for people in the room. It isn't good for the people who end up feeling like spectators because they're watching from home. This experience that we have together every Sunday via Zoom, where I get to see all your faces and we get to do this all in the same way, feels more authentic and genuinely like worship to me than if we did it with some of us in one place and some of us in another, in a way that's not authentic to our tradition. So I personally feel really, really comfortable waiting as long as we have to wait, so that we can all be together again, doing the same thing, whatever it is.
I agree.
I want to just add, and then we'll come to you, Vicki. I know I have heard a comment floating around, and Deanne just shared that there's some of this coming up already in our survey responses around feeling like the diocesan guidelines limit put particular limitations on individuals who are 65 or older, and don't allow those in that population to sort of make their own choices. I think a counterpoint to that, not to say that there's not something valid in that perspective, but I think a counterpoint to also consider is, in the same way that people under 65 are being asked to wait to celebrate fully in the Eucharist, to celebrate fully church in person, that that even if you're over 65 and you feel comfortable receiving the Eucharist, there are members of our community who don't, and who don't have that choice, who are explicitly not able to be present because of health concerns. And so I think this question of choice is actually a really interesting one, and the privilege of being able to make a choice. Whereas there are members of our community who are not in that position, and whatever your age, 65 and over or 65 and under, I think the invitation is actually quite the same. Vicki, let's come to you. Oh, I think you're muted. Yeah,
I got it. I just want to say thank you, Julie. I really agree with you. I think we are one body, and I think we need to wait until everyone can do the same thing together.
I see Dick clapping. So I just want to say that this is a possibility of this regathering process, and it's one of the reasons why we have framed it as we have with the survey and being really clear about the guidance. It may be that we opt not to regather at all in this phase, and not to regather at all in some other phases down the line, until there can be more full sharing in whatever we are doing. I think those conversations are still unfolding, but that is absolutely one of the possibilities for us as a parish.
Well, and I'm glad that there are guidelines for us to consider, how we might gather if we need to for a funeral, right? Or for some kind of special thing that we can do in a small group that's meaningful. So even though we might decide not to apply those to a large group coming to worship, we can apply them to individual situations where we might deem it appropriate for a few people to gather.
Mm-hmm. So I just see a comment from Rick. Why not expand the concept of Eucharistic ministers for home distribution? So I think that is a interesting question. We are going to be more and more able to commission more pastoral care. I still wonder about the current guidelines and how they specifically seem to discourage any partaking in the Eucharist until the community as a whole can. But certainly looking at LEVs, looking at our other pastoral ministries in general, is very much a part of what our own kind of regathering team is considering. Carol, you have your hand up, and then I think we should wrap up so everyone can get on with their day. Oh, maybe Joe too. Go on ahead, Carol. Oh, I can't hear you, Carol. Can you all? Still can't hear you. Oh. If you can, you're welcome to type it in and we'll read it from there. Joe?
Yeah, you mentioned yourself about having had an LEV visit you when you were needing it, and how important that was to you. And I know in my experience of being an LEV, how it lifts me more into the spirit of the communion when I'm with somebody, and realize how important it must be to those receiving it. And I'm just wondering what you envision that looking like sooner rather than later, if there is a way to do that.
So when the bishop has talked about the reasons for not allowing the distribution of communion, the primary thing he comes back to theologically is this 1 Corinthians passage. The primary thing he comes back to practically is that there's no way to distribute Eucharist and socially distance, that there's not a good way for us to actually be 6 feet apart from each other when we are feeding one another. Now, if you put a room of clergy together, as has happened on Zoom with the bishop, there's going to be 40 different suggestions about how we can all bring our little sake cups or our little shot glasses or our own personal, something. But because we have to touch in order to understand ourselves to be celebrating the Eucharist, at least this is his interpreting of the rubrics, and it's his purview as the bishop to, interpret these with us. there is not a good way currently to do that.
Even if we only did the one part.
Even if we only did the one part, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And the challenge too about us visiting, right, is that, you know, I come into your house, then I go into someone else's house, and I go into someone else's house. You know, what have I gained in one house that I'm now contaminating in someone else's, right? So that is a really effective way to spread a virus.
Or even outside.
Or even outside. And the image that I had of how we do this is purely an engineering solution where everybody brings their own little paper cup with a piece of bread in it, and they, with their name on it, you lay it on the altar. You have to come up one at a time. It's all on the altar at the same time being consecrated, and they can come up one at a time and get their little cup and share it with themselves. But that's, you know, that's pushing a whole lot of, you know, what ifs. And now you can see why some places would begin to have problems around that. And then once again, you wind up with people who don't want to get involved in being that close to everybody else right now. And so then you would have, as Julia has noted, you would have the risk takers and the non-risk takers. And we would become two different congregations. And that's probably not a good thing.
Fritz, let's go to you for one last question and then we'll wrap it up, or one last comment, whatever it is.
Well, I'm again going back to the rubrics. As I recall, there is a Christian version of the minyan that a priest can't celebrate the Eucharist by themselves. And that's what we seem to be asking in having them consecrate the elements and then distribute them remotely. Is that a hard and fast rule, or how do you guys get around that?
So Fritz, I think at the time when your audio cut out and you had to hop off and rejoin, I mentioned that every time that I have celebrated the Eucharist here, Deanne has come in and sat in the back of the church. So we do have a pretty hard and fast understanding that at least one other person needs to be present for us to understand it to be a collective feast. Okay, this has been so engaging. I'm so grateful to each of you for your wisdom, to Julie and Sheldon for your thoughts, all of the questions. Two things, please take the survey if you have not. If you feel like there's more from the survey that you want us to know about your comfort level, your experience of worship, all of that, please feel free to reach out to me or anyone on the vestry. And second, as you're having conversations about gathering or not gathering with your peers from the parish, I hope that you'll bring everything you brought in this conversation to those conversations, including the generosity of spirit. I hope that we're trying to model around everyone just doing their best right now. I think our bishop is doing his best. I think Bishop Lucindo is doing her best. I think the presiding bishop is doing their best. I think each of you is doing your best in showing up as part of the body of Christ. And that if we can be generous in our understanding of each other's intentions, that will go a long way toward getting us through this. So thank you all so much. It's wonderful to share in this time. I learned a lot. I appreciate being with you, and we'll see you sometime this week, if not next Sunday.
Thank you all.
Take care.